Welcome, dear reader. If you have picked this up, hoping for something comfortable, a quiet evening's distraction perhaps, or a tale that asks nothing of you, then I must warn you gently, you have chosen the wrong story. What follows is not simply a mystery. It is a reckoning, a case that tested the finest mind I have ever had the privilege of knowing, and one that, if I am being entirely honest, humbled him in ways I had never witnessed before and have not seen since. The year was 1900s. London was a city drunk on its own cleverness. Steam and brass and the smell of coal smoke hung over everything like a permanent weather. Men of science were gods in those days, or believed themselves to be. Invention was moving faster than wisdom, and there were those who had noticed that gap and were prepared to exploit it. A man was dead in a locked room. No wounds, no poison that any doctor could name. Only a golden mechanical bird, singing softly on his desk, its tiny jeweled eyes catching the lamplight. Scotland Yard called it a heart attack. Sherlock Holmes called it murder. This is the story of who was right, and what it cost us both to find out. Settle in, the fire is lit. The game, as my companion would say, is afoot. Dr. John H. Watson, MD, the dead man and the singing bird. It was a Thursday evening in the third week of November when the name Cornelius Blackwood first entered our lives, and it did so not with any particular drama, but in the quiet, almost apologetic manner of a letter slipped beneath the door of our Baker Street rooms while Holmes and I sat on opposite sides of a dying fire. Holmes noticed it before I did, naturally. He noticed everything before I did. One moment he was reclining in his armchair with his eyes half closed and his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin. That particular pose which I'd learned meant he was not sleeping, but thinking, and thinking hard. And the next he had unfolded himself from the chair, crossed the room in 3 long strides, and was already holding the envelope up to the lamp before I had so much as turned my head. "Not Scotland Yard," he said, more to himself than to me. The handwriting is too controlled for a man in genuine distress, yet the pressure of the pen increases toward the end of each line. Whoever wrote this was calm when they began, and frightened by the time they finished. He slit it open and read it in silence. I watched his face, which told me nothing, as it almost always did when he wished it to tell me nothing. "Well," I said, after a patience I was rather proud of. "A watchmaker," Holmes said, or rather, the watchmaker's daughter. Her father, one Cornelius Blackwood of Aldgate, was found dead in his private study this morning. The door was locked from the inside. The windows were latched. There were no marks of violence upon the body, and the attending physician has already signed a certificate attributing death to cardiac failure. He lowered the letter and looked at me over it with those pale, sharp eyes. She does not believe him. The physician? The certificate. I set down my book. And what do you believe? Holmes dropped the letter onto the mantelpiece and reached for his coat. "I believe, Watson, that a man who has spent 40 years building the most intricate mechanical devices in London does not die of fright on an ordinary Thursday evening. I believe there is something in that letter that the daughter has not yet put into words, something she saw but did not understand. And I believe," he added, wrapping his scarf with the efficiency of a man who has spent too many winters chasing things through cold streets, "that if we do not go tonight, whatever evidence remains will be tidied away by morning." There was nothing to argue with in any of that. I found my coat. The Blackwood premises occupied a narrow, slightly crooked building on a lane just off Aldgate High Street, the sort of place that looked as though it had been wedged between its neighbours by force and had simply decided to make the best of it. The ground floor was the shop, its window dark at this hour but still displaying, behind the glass, a collection of clocks and pocket watches arranged with the kind of obsessive precision that spoke of a man who could not bear disorder in any form. A constable stood at the door, young and cold and visibly relieved to have something to do when we arrived. Holmes produced a card in a manner so authoritative that the boy stepped aside, without quite understanding why, and we were inside. The shop smelled of metal and oil, and the particular dry warmth of a place heated by a small stove worked too hard. The ticking was extraordinary, dozens of clocks all running, none of them quite agreeing on the time, creating a layered, almost musical sound that filled the silence in a way that felt, given the circumstances, deeply unsettling. A woman was waiting for us at the foot of the stairs. She was perhaps 30, dark-haired, composed in the way that people are composed when they have been crying for hours and have simply run out of the energy for it. She held a handkerchief but was not using it. "Mr. Holmes," she said. "Thank you for coming. I am Eleanor Blackwood." "Miss Blackwood," Holmes took her hand briefly. "This is my colleague, Dr. Watson. Tell me, has anything in the study been moved since your father was found?" "No, I made sure of it. The constable wanted to open the windows, but I told him to leave everything." "Good, that was very good. Take us up." The study was on the first floor at the back of the building, overlooking a narrow yard. It was a small room made smaller by the quantity of things in it. Work tables covered in parts and tools, and shelves of reference books with broken spines, drawings pinned to every available inch of wall, and everywhere the evidence of a man who thought with his hands as much as his head. Cornelius Blackwood was still in his chair. He was a large man, or had been, the kind of large that comes from a lifetime of physical work rather than indulgence. White-haired, broad-shouldered, with the thick, careful hands of a craftsman. He was seated at his main work table, slightly reclined, his head tipped back at an angle that might have suggested sleep if not for the absolute stillness of him. His face wore an expression that I, as a doctor, found difficult to read. Not pain, exactly. Not peace, either. Something between the two. A kind of arrested surprise, as though the last thing he had experienced had been not agony but revelation. And I made my examination while Holmes moved around the room with that silent, methodical attention of his, touching nothing, looking at everything. "Cardiac failure is not impossible," I said, straightening up. "The age, the build, he was under strain, certainly. But there are no petechial hemorrhages, no cyanosis, no indication of the kind of physical distress that typically precedes a coronary event. He does not look like a man who died fighting for breath." "No," Holmes agreed quietly. "He does not." It was then that I heard it. I had been so focused on the body that I had not, until that moment, registered the sound. But once I heard it, I could not understand how I had missed it. It was coming from the work table, from an object perhaps 18 inches to the left of Blackwood's right hand, positioned on a small velvet stand as though it were a thing of considerable value. It was a bird, mechanical, golden, approximately the size of a thrush. Its wings were folded, its head slightly tilted, and from somewhere within its exquisitely crafted body came a sound that was, there is no other word for it, singing. A thin, clear, repeating melody, 4 or 5 notes cycling endlessly, the tone somewhere between a flute and a music box, but purer than either. "Holmes," I said. "I know," he said. He was already standing over it, his hands clasped behind his back, his face very still. "I've been listening to it since we entered the room." "What is it?" "It is," Holmes said slowly, "the most dangerous thing in this room, possibly the most dangerous thing in London." He looked up at me, and I have absolutely no idea yet why. Holmes and Watson enter the scene. I have written, over the years, a great many accounts of Sherlock Holmes at work, and I am aware that in several of them I have perhaps painted him in colours slightly more heroic than strict accuracy would demand. It is a fault of affection, I think, rather than dishonesty. When you have watched a man do what Holmes could do, when you have seen him pull truth from what appeared to be nothing, again and again with that maddening, brilliant calm, you develop a tendency to remember him at his best. But I made myself a promise when I sat down to write this particular account. I promised I would be accurate. All of it, the brilliance and the blindness both. And so I will tell you that on that Thursday night in November, he's standing in the dead watchmaker's study with the mechanical bird singing its 4-note melody into the lamplight. Sherlock Holmes was not immediately brilliant. He was, for perhaps 10 full minutes, simply quiet. And in the particular quality of that quiet, I recognized something I'd only seen a handful of times before. He was uncertain. Not lost. Holmes was never truly lost, even when he appeared to be, but uncertain in the way a man is uncertain when the shape of a thing refuses to resolve itself into anything familiar. He circled the room twice. He stood at the window and looked down into the dark yard below. He examined the lock on the door, a solid, old-fashioned deadbolt that had required the constable and the building's landlord together to force open that morning. And he examined the latch on each of the 2 windows, both of which were of the kind that hook from the inside and cannot be manipulated from without leaving clear evidence of tampering. There was no such evidence. Miss Blackwood, Holmes said at last, without turning from the window. Your father. Was he a man who entertained visitors in this room? Eleanor Blackwood stood in the doorway, unwilling, I sensed, to come further inside. Occasionally. Colleagues, sometimes, men who shared his interests. And the bird, when did it appear? She hesitated. About 3 weeks ago. He brought it home one evening and would not tell me where it had come from. He was... excited is not quite the right word. He was agitated. I thought at first that he had made a purchase he felt guilty about. Father was not an extravagant man, but it was something else. He seemed almost frightened of it. Holmes turned then. Frightened. You are certain of that word? I am. He kept it covered with a cloth most of the time. He would not let me wind it or touch it, and twice in the last week I heard it singing in the night from behind the closed door of this room, and when I knocked, he told me to go back to bed in a voice that did not sound like his. Holmes looked at the bird for a long moment. Then he said, very carefully, Did your father have any enemies, Miss Blackwood? Anyone who stood to gain from his death? The question was gently put, but Eleanor Blackwood's composure shifted slightly at it, in the way a wall shifts when something underground moves. There is my uncle, she said, my father's brother, Gerald Blackwood. They had a disagreement some years ago over the business. She paused. Over money, in the end, as most disagreements are. What nature of disagreement? Gerald believed he was owed a partnership. He had invested in the shop in its early years when father was struggling. But father bought him out eventually, and Gerald felt the terms were not fair. They had not spoken in 4 years. And Gerald, what does he do now? He calls himself an investor, Eleanor said, with a flatness that communicated her opinion of this description precisely. He has interests in several manufacturing concerns. He knows a great many people. Useful people, he always said. She looked at Holmes with tired, direct eyes. I did not put this in the letter because I did not want to seem as though I was simply looking for someone to blame, but you asked. I asked, Holmes agreed, because I needed to know. Thank you, I'm Miss Blackwood. I wonder if you would be kind enough to wait downstairs. Dr. Watson and I will not be much longer. When she had gone, Holmes moved immediately to the work table and bent over the mechanical bird with an attention so focused it was almost physical. He did not touch it. He examined it from every angle, the seam lines where the casing joined, the tiny hinged panels on the underside of the wings, the almost invisible mechanism at the base where, presumably, the device was wound. Come here, Watson, he said quietly. I came and stood beside him. Up close, the bird was even more remarkable. The feathers, each one individually crafted from beaten gold leaf over a wire frame, overlapped with anatomical precision. The beak was slightly open. The eyes were chips of amber glass set in gold wire, and they caught the lamp in a way that was, despite everything, beautiful. Listen, Holmes said. I listened. The 4-note melody cycled on. It was, I thought again, extraordinarily pure for a mechanical device. No flutter, no waver, none of the slight irregularity you hear in even the finest music boxes. It was almost too pure, too steady. The tone, I said. Yes. It doesn't vary at all. No, Holmes said, it does not. And that, Watson, is not how any mechanical singing bird I have ever encountered behaves. The bellows mechanism, which is what produces the sound in every such device I am aware of, introduces a natural variation, a breathing, almost. This has none. He straightened up. This bird is not producing sound the way a music box produces sound. It is doing something else entirely. Something I have not yet identified. He was quiet for a moment, and then he did something that surprised me. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small notebook, the battered, brown-covered one he always carried, and he wrote something in it, tore the page out, folded it, and put it in a separate pocket. What was that, I asked. A hypothesis, he said. I'm putting it away deliberately. I've found, in certain cases, that my first instinct is so strong that it tends to foreclose other possibilities before I have properly examined them. I want to look at everything else in this room before I return to that instinct. It was, I thought at the time, a sensible precaution. I did not yet understand that it was also, in its way, the beginning of his mistake. We spent another 40 minutes in that room, Holmes went through it with the systematic thoroughness that was his particular gift. Not the dramatic, rapid-fire deduction of popular imagination, but the slow, almost tedious accumulation of small observations that he then carried inside himself like stones in a pocket, feeling their weight and shape until their significance became clear. He found several things of interest. On the work table, beneath a leather roll of tools, there was a sheaf of papers covered in Blackwood's handwriting, technical drawings mostly interspersed with notes in a cramped, hurried hand. Holmes examined these for a long time without speaking. Several of the drawings appeared to relate to the bird, cross-sections, measurements, annotations, but others were of something different, something larger, and whatever it was, more the drawings had been partially obscured, as though Blackwood had thought better of committing the full design to paper and had scored through the relevant sections with heavy ink. He was working on something, I offered. He was working on something he did not want found, Holmes corrected. He photographed the pages in his memory. I'd seen him do this before, that particular stillness that meant he was filing rather than thinking, and set them back exactly as he had found them. On the floor, near the base of Blackwood's chair, there was a small dark stain that I initially took for spilled ink, but which, on closer examination, was something else. Holmes crouched over it for some time, sniffed it once with that unself-conscious thoroughness that still occasionally startled visitors, and then stood without comment. At the window, on the exterior sill, there were marks, faint ones, barely visible in the lamplight, but Holmes saw them and I saw Holmes see them, and I watched his face do something complicated and then smooth itself out again. "Someone stood here," he said, "recently. The marks are consistent with a ladder, here and here." He indicated two faint compressions in the soft wood of the exterior sill. "And yet the window is latched from the inside. Could Blackwood have relatched it himself, after someone left? Possibly, or the marks are older than they appear." He stepped back. "We will come back to this." We left just after midnight. The constable was still at the door, more thoroughly frozen now, and Holmes paused on the step and looked up at the face of the building for a moment, before turning up his collar against the November wind. "What are you thinking?" I asked, as we walked toward the main road in search of a cab. "I am thinking," Holmes said, "about sound, about what sound can do, about the fact that we treat it as the most harmless of things. It passes through walls, it fills rooms, it vanishes into air without leaving a mark. And yet it is a physical force. It moves things. It can, under the right conditions, break things." He paused. "Or stop them." I looked at him. "You think the bird killed him?" "I think the bird was present when he died," Holmes said carefully. "Whether it killed him is a question that requires me to understand what, precisely, it is doing. And for that, I need to speak to someone who knows rather more about acoustic science than I do." He flagged down a passing cab. "Tomorrow morning, Watson. There is a man at the Royal Institution who owes me a considerable favour." He said nothing more for the rest of the journey home, but I noticed when we reached Baker Street and he hung up his coat and settled back into his armchair that he did not reach for his violin as he usually did when a problem was working itself through him. He simply sat, and the expression on his face was one I did not have a name for then. Looking back, I think it was the expression of a man who already half knew the answer and was afraid of what it meant. The investigation deepens. The Royal Institution on Albemarle Street has a particular smell in the mornings, chalk dust and cold stone, and the faint chemical undertone of a building that has housed serious science for the better part of a century. I've always found it faintly intimidating. The way serious places are intimidating when you arrive at them with a question you are not entirely sure how to ask. Holmes had no such difficulty. He never did. The man we had come to see was a Professor Edmund Hargrove, a small, precise, energetic individual of perhaps 60, with the white side whiskers of a Victorian patriarch and the restless hands of someone who had spent a lifetime building things and could not quite stop even in conversation. He taught acoustics and wave mechanics, and Holmes had, some 2 years prior, helped recover a collection of irreplaceable research papers stolen from Hargrove's office by a jealous colleague. The professor had been, Holmes told me on the cab ride over, extravagantly grateful. He received us in his private laboratory on the upper floor, a long, decluttered room full of tuning forks in various sizes, resonance chambers of brass and glass, coils of copper wire, and several devices I could not name and did not ask about. He listened to Holmes's account of the Blackwood case with the focused attention of a man who recognised territory he knew. When Holmes finished, Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're describing a directed acoustic resonance device." "I'm describing a golden mechanical bird," Holmes said. "But yes, I believe that is what it is." Hargrove stood up and went to one of his shelves. He took down a tuning fork, a large one mounted on a wooden base, and set it on the table between us. "You know the basic principle, I assume. Strike a tuning fork at a specific frequency, hold it near a wine glass tuned to that same frequency, and the glass will begin to vibrate. Increase the intensity sufficiently, and the glass will shatter." He looked at Holmes. "This is not new science. Chladni demonstrated the physical effects of sound on matter before the turn of the century. What you are describing is an application of that principle, a deliberate, engineered application. To the human heart," Holmes said. Hargrove did not flinch, which told me he had already gone there himself, in the few seconds of silence before he spoke. "The heart is a muscle. It operates on an electrical rhythm, a remarkably precise one. It is not, in theory, immune to external frequency interference. There has been some theoretical work, nothing published, nothing I would attach my name to, suggesting that sustained exposure to a frequency in a specific range could induce arrhythmia in a susceptible individual." He paused. "In a healthy young person, the effect might be negligible. In an older man, under stress, with any existing weakness in the cardiac muscle, it would be fatal," I said. I heard my own voice come out rather flat. "It could be," Hargrove said carefully. "Theoretically. And to build such a device," Holmes said, "what would that require? Extraordinary precision. You would need to know the target's specific cardiac frequency, which varies between individuals, and engineer the device to produce that frequency at sufficient amplitude and in a sustained enough manner to cause disruption. It would require someone with very detailed knowledge of both acoustic mechanics and," he hesitated, "human physiology. Or," Holmes said slowly, "someone who had access to a craftsman capable of the mechanical engineering and a scientist capable of the physiological calculation." Hargrove looked at him. "Yes, or that." Holmes stood. He had the look he sometimes had at moments like this. Not excitement exactly, but a kind of sharp focusing, like a lens adjusting. "One more question, Professor. The frequency required. Would it be audible? To a person in the room?" Hargrove thought about it. At the lower end of the effective range, possibly not, or only barely. A low hum, perhaps. Something a person might attribute to the building, or the street outside. He paused. At the higher end, yes, it would be heard. But it would not sound threatening. It might sound, in fact, rather like music. Holmes thanked him, and we left. On the stairs, I said, "Holmes, if what Hargrove is describing is accurate, if the bird was specifically calibrated to Blackwood's cardiac frequency, then whoever built it had access to detailed knowledge of Blackwood himself. His medical history, perhaps. His physiology." "Yes," Holmes said. "That is not a weapon you build against a stranger." "No," Holmes said, "it is not." We went next to Aldgate, but not to the Blackwood premises. Holmes directed the cab to a solicitor's office on Fenchurch Street, a Mr. Aubrey Casson, who had handled the Blackwood family's legal affairs for the better part of 2 decades. Casson was a thin and dry man of the kind that accumulates information the way other men accumulate furniture, not out of any particular passion, but because it simply builds up around them over time. He was, predictably, cautious about speaking to us. Holmes was, predictably, persuasive. Within 20 minutes, we had learned the following: that Cornelius Blackwood's estate, comprising the shop, its contents, its inventory, and a not inconsiderable sum held in 2 separate accounts, was to pass in its entirety to his daughter Eleanor, that Gerald Blackwood, the brother, had indeed been bought out of his original investment some 11 years prior, at terms which Casson described as equitable, though Gerald did not find them so. That Gerald had attempted, through Casson's office, to contest the buyout arrangement on 2 separate occasions, and had been unsuccessful both times, and that, most interestingly, Cornelius Blackwood had visited Casson's office just 6 weeks ago to update his will, adding a specific clause that prevented Gerald from making any future claim against the estate, regardless of circumstance. "He anticipated trouble," I said, when we were back in the cab. He anticipated something, Holmes said. A man does not add that kind of clause to a will without a specific reason. He knew Gerald was moving against him. He knew it recently enough that 6 weeks ago felt urgent. He drummed his fingers once on his knee. We need to find Gerald Blackwood. Finding Gerald Blackwood proved initially more difficult than it should have been. The address Eleanor had provided, a set of rooms in Bloomsbury, turned out to be a former address. Gerald had moved, apparently, some 4 months ago, to new premises in Clerkenwell. Holmes's network of contacts, which extended into parts of London that most respectable people preferred not to acknowledge, produced this information by early afternoon, along with several additional details that were, in their way, illuminating. Gerald Blackwood, it emerged, had over the past 18 months developed a close association with a man named Silas Vaughan, a name that meant nothing to me but produced in Holmes a stillness that I had learned to read as recognition. Vaughan, I said. You know him? Of him, Holmes said. He is a manufacturer, or was. He had a factory in Southwark, producing precision instruments. Scientific equipment, mostly. He lost it 18 months ago in a dispute with his creditors, and since then has been operating in a somewhat informal capacity. Selling expertise, consulting he calls it. Holmes's expression suggested his opinion of this description was similar to Eleanor's opinion of her uncle's self-designation as an investor. He is a clever man, Watson, genuinely clever. He understands things that most people in this city have not yet imagined exist. Such as acoustic resonance devices? Such as those, yes. We went to Clerkenwell. Gerald Blackwood's rooms were on the second floor of a well-maintained building on St. John's Lane. The kind of address that was respectable without being distinguished, which seemed, from everything we had learned, entirely characteristic of the man. He received us without surprise, which was itself interesting. A man who has just been informed of his brother's death. And even a brother he hated tends to receive unexpected callers with a certain rawness. Gerald Blackwood received us as though he had been expecting us, or someone like us, and had prepared accordingly. He was perhaps 55, shorter than I had imagined from Eleanor's description, with a neatly trimmed grey beard and the careful, composed eyes of someone who had learned long ago that expression was a thing to be managed rather than felt. He offered us chairs and tea, both of which Holmes declined, and settled himself across from us with his hands folded in his lap. I imagine this is about Cornelius, he said. It is, Holmes said. I'm sorry for your loss. Gerald's expression acknowledged this without being particularly moved by it. We were not close, as I suspect you already know. What is it you want to ask me? Holmes asked him, calmly and methodically, about his relationship with his brother, about the original investment and buyout, about his current business activities, and about Silas Vaughan. To each question, Gerald gave answers that were smooth, complete, and I felt this as a physical sensation, the way you feel a draft before you can see where it's coming from, carefully shaped, not lies, precisely, but answers that had been thought about in advance, answers that covered the ground without quite covering all of it. On the subject of Vaughan, he was particularly fluent. Yes, he knew Vaughan. They had mutual interests in the manufacturing sector. They met occasionally for dinner. It was a professional acquaintance, nothing more. And your brother, Holmes said. Did he know Vaughan? A very slight pause, almost nothing. I have no idea, Gerald said. I did not discuss my acquaintances with Cornelius. As I said, we were not close. Holmes nodded pleasantly and stood. Thank you, Mr. Blackwood. I may need to speak with you again. Of course, Gerald said. I'm always available. We were halfway down St. John's Lane before I said it. He's lying. Parts of him are lying, Holmes said, which is more interesting than if all of him were. A complete lie is easy to construct and easy, usually, to detect. A partial lie, the kind where a man tells you 90% of the truth and omits the one thing that makes the other 90% mean something different, that is considerably harder to unpick. He walked in silence for a moment. Did you notice his hands? I thought back. Folded in his lap. Still. Precisely. Gerald Blackwood is not a still man. I could see it in everything else about him, the set of his shoulders, the way he positioned his feet, the micro-movements of his jaw when he was composing an answer. He is a man of physical restlessness, and yet his hands were completely, deliberately still. Holmes paused at the corner. A man keeps his hands still when he does not trust them to be seen moving. What does that mean exactly? It means, Holmes said, flagging a cab with one raised arm, that he was managing himself very carefully, and that whatever he is hiding, it is something his hands know about. He climbed into the cab and gave the address for Baker Street, and I climbed in after him, and for a while neither of us spoke. The city moved past the windows, the grey afternoon light, the traffic, of the endless noise of London doing what London did regardless of who was living or dying inside it. Then Holmes said, almost to himself, "Blackwood built the bird. I am sure of it. Vaughan provided the science. Gerald provided the motive and, I suspect, the crucial piece of information that made the device possible. Blackwood's cardiac frequency," I said. "How would Gerald have known that?" Holmes looked at me. "Because 11 years ago, Watson, when they were still brothers in any meaningful sense of the word, Cornelius Blackwood suffered a minor cardiac episode. It would have been attended by a physician. There would have been records." He paused. "Gerald would have known, he would have remembered, and when the time came, he would have known exactly who to tell." The cab turned onto Baker Street. Holmes stared out the window and said nothing more, but I saw his hand move briefly to the pocket where he had placed the folded paper. His first hypothesis. He touched it once through the fabric of his coat, as though reassuring himself it was still there. Then he let it go. Holmes makes a mistake. I have debated, in the years since, whether to include this section at all. There is a version of this account in which I move smoothly from part 3 to part 5, from the cab ride home to the resolution, and the seam would be invisible. Holmes would appear, as he usually appears in my published accounts, as a man who moved in a straight line from question to answer, pausing only for dramatic effect. It would be a tidier story, a more comfortable one, but it would not be true, and I made myself a promise. So, that evening, Holmes made an arrest. Not a formal one, he had no authority for that, but he went to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard with enough apparent certainty to convince that good, literal-minded man to bring in Silas Vaughan for questioning. Holmes had constructed, from the available evidence, a case that pointed at Vaughan as the central figure, the architect of the murder, rather than the instrument of it. His reasoning was, on the surface, compelling. Vaughan had the scientific knowledge. Vaughan had the manufacturing capability, even in his reduced circumstances. Vaughan had been in Gerald Blackwood's orbit for 18 months, roughly the period Holmes estimated it would have taken to design and build a device of such complexity. And Vaughan, Holmes had discovered through his network of contacts that afternoon, he had visited Aldgate 3 times in the past 2 months. 3 visits, none of them to the shop's front entrance, all of them, as far as Holmes could determine, to the rear of the building. It was, I thought that evening, a solid case. I said so. Holmes accepted the compliment with the particular quiet of a man who is slightly too confident to feel he needs it. Vaughan was brought in at 9 o'clock that night. I was not present for the interview. Lestrade drew the line at that. But Holmes was, and he came back to Baker Street just after 11 with something in his face that I had very rarely seen there. He sat down. He did not remove his coat. He sat in his armchair in his coat and his scarf and stared at the fireplace for a long time. "Well," I said eventually. "Vaughan's alibi," Holmes said, "is absolute. He was in Edinburgh. Has been for 10 days. A lecture series at the university. 20 witnesses, including 3 professors of impeccable standing, and a hotel receipt that Lestrade's man has already verified." He paused. "He did not build the bird, Watson. He cannot have. He was not in London." I said nothing. There did not seem to be anything immediately useful to say. Furthermore, Holmes continued in the tone of a man reading from a document he finds deeply unpleasant, Vaughan's visits to the rear of the Blackwood premises were, in fact, visits to the printing shop 2 doors down, where he has been having a monograph reproduced. The rear entrances adjoin. My contact confused them. The fire crackled. Somewhere outside, a carriage went past. "The 3 visits to Aldgate," I said carefully. "Your contact was wrong," Holmes said, simply, flatly. No elaboration, no qualification, just the 2 words, sitting there in the room like stones dropped into water. I'd seen Holmes wrong before. He would dispute this if asked, but I had, occasionally, seen him reach a conclusion that subsequent evidence did not support. What I had not seen, or not often, was this particular quality of stillness that followed, It was not embarrassment exactly. Holmes was not, in my experience, a man much troubled by embarrassment. It was something more specific, the discomfort of a man who had allowed his instinct to outrun his evidence, and who knew, precisely and without comfort, at which moment the separation had occurred. He had wanted Vaughan to be the architect. He had felt it, and feeling it, he had assembled the evidence toward it rather than letting the evidence assemble itself. It was the oldest mistake in detection, and Holmes knew it better than anyone alive, which made the having of it considerably worse. "What about Gerald?" I said. "Gerald remains a person of interest," Holmes said. "But without Vaughan, the mechanism of the thing changes. Gerald is not a scientist. He could not have built the device alone, and if Vaughan did not build it, then someone else did. Someone I have not yet identified." He finally reached up and unwound his scarf, slowly, as though the action required thought. "I have also," he added, "rather embarrassed Lestrade, which will make the next stage of this investigation more difficult." "He'll come around?" "He will be insufferable for at least a week first." Holmes dropped the scarf over the arm of the chair. "I owe Vaughan an apology, which I will send in writing. I owe Lestrade a result, which I will have to produce through other means now that his cooperation is temporarily withdrawn. And I owe this case," he said, looking at the fire, "a great deal more rigour than I have given it." He reached into his coat pocket then, and took out the folded paper, the one he had written in Blackwood's study on the first night, his original hypothesis, deliberately set aside. He unfolded it and looked at it. I could not see what was written on it from where I sat. I did not ask. Whatever it said, Holmes read it twice, and then he folded it again, very carefully, and placed it not back in his pocket but on the table beside his chair where he could see it. "Tomorrow," he said, "we start again, from the beginning, from the bird." He picked up his violin then, finally, and began to play. Not one of his own compositions, which tended toward the frenetic when his mind was working. Something slow, something I recognized after a moment as Bach. It was, I had learned over the years, what Holmes played when he was being honest with himself. The truth begins to sing. He did not sleep that night. I know this because I did not sleep particularly well myself. The case had lodged itself in my mind in the way that certain cases did, not with the excitement of a puzzle, but with the particular unease of something that felt genuinely wrong in the world. And twice in the small hours I heard him moving in the sitting room below. Once I heard the violin again, briefly, just a few bars of something I did not recognize, and then silence. And once, around 4 a.m, I heard the distinct sound of the Baker Street door opening and closing, which meant he had gone out into the November dark for reasons he would not explain, and I had learned not to ask about. He was at the breakfast table when I came down at 7, looking against all physical probability completely alert. There was a fresh pot of tea, which was Holmes's version of a peace offering after a night of being difficult, and there were 3 telegrams on the table beside his plate, all of them opened. "Sit down, Watson," he said. "I have a great deal to tell you, and I would prefer to tell it in order." I sat. I poured tea. I waited. "The bird," he said, "was made by Cornelius Blackwood himself." I set down my cup. "Blackwood built the weapon that killed him?" "He built the bird," Holmes said carefully. Whether he knew it was a weapon is the question I have been working on since approximately 2 o'clock this morning, and I believe, though I cannot yet prove, that he did not, or not entirely. He picked up the first telegram. "I went last night to speak with a man named Ferrers who runs a metals workshop in Bermondsey. He is one of perhaps 4 men in London capable of producing gold leaf mechanical feathering of the quality we saw on that bird. I showed him a sketch I made from memory. He recognized it immediately. Blackwood commissioned the feathering from him. Blackwood brought the frame to him already constructed and asked him to apply the gold work. 6 weeks ago. He paid in cash, which Ferrers found unusual but not alarming. Blackwood had used him before for shop display pieces, and had always been a straightforward client. Holmes set the telegram down. Ferrers said Blackwood seemed distracted, unhappy in fact. He made a remark. Ferrers remembered it clearly because it struck him as odd. He said, and I am quoting Ferrers quoting Blackwood, "So allow for some distortion. It wants to sing, but I don't know what song it's been given." The room was quiet for a moment. He didn't know what frequency it had been tuned to, I said slowly. He suspected something was wrong with it, Holmes said. He had been given, or had received by some means, the internal mechanism, the acoustic component, the part that actually produces the frequency, and he had been asked, or had agreed, to house it, to build around it. The golden bird was a casing, Watson, an extraordinarily beautiful, extraordinarily expensive casing, and Blackwood built it not knowing, or not fully knowing, what he was housing. Who gave him the mechanism? Holmes picked up the second telegram. This took rather more work. I contacted 3 people through the night, a retired instrument maker in Islington, a lecturer in physics at King's College, and a woman in Stepney who is not, strictly speaking, operating within the law, but who has access to information about the city's scientific underground that no legitimate source can match. He paused. The acoustic mechanism inside that bird was built by a man named Dorian Pell. He is, or was, a specialist in resonance engineering. He worked briefly at the Royal Institution in the mid-70s, before leaving under circumstances that Hargrove, I notice, I did not mention to us yesterday. Hargrove knows him? Hargrove dismissed him. There was a falling out over a research paper. Pell had been working on the physiological effects of specific frequencies on cardiac tissue, and Hargrove considered the direction of the work irresponsible. He put a stop to it, and Pell left. Holmes's expression was even. I find it interesting that when I described a device that was almost certainly built on the foundations of Pell's research, Hargrove did not mention this. I thought about the professor, his precise manner, his restless hands, his careful theoretical distance from anything that might sound like an accusation. You think Hargrove is involved? I think Hargrove knows more than he told us, Holmes said. Whether that constitutes involvement remains to be established. What I know is that Dorian Pell built the mechanism, and that Pell is currently employed, he glanced at the third telegram, as a technical consultant to a manufacturing concern based in Clerkenwell. The word Clerkenwell landed in the room like a dropped coin. Gerald Blackwood's address, I said. Gerald Blackwood's address, Holmes confirmed. He laid it out for me then, across the breakfast table, with the methodical clarity that returned to him when he had spent a sufficient number of hours alone with a problem. The theory was not yet complete. There were still pieces he did not have, but the shape of it was finally visible, the way a landscape becomes visible as fog burns off. Not all at once, but steadily, revealing first the near distances and then the far. Gerald Blackwood had, over the course of the previous 4 years, assembled a plan. Not a sudden plan, not the plan of a man acting on impulse or anger, but the slow, considered plan of someone who had decided that the conventional routes to what he wanted were closed, and had therefore begun looking for unconventional ones. What he wanted was the shop. Not out of sentiment. Gerald Blackwood did not appear to be a sentimental man. But because beneath the shop, in the basement that Cornelius had never allowed anyone else to access, there was something Gerald believed was worth considerably more than the building above it. The drawings, I said, the ones in Blackwood's study, the cross-sections of something larger, something he had scored through. Cornelius had spent the better part of a decade developing a mechanism, Holmes said, not a bird. There was something considerably more significant, a precision timing device of a kind that did not yet exist commercially. The applications were, depending on your perspective, either extraordinary or terrifying. In manufacturing, it would have been revolutionary. In other contexts, he left that thought incomplete, which was unlike him, and I did not press it. Gerald had learned of it. He wanted it. And Cornelius, knowing his brother, had gone to considerable lengths to ensure Gerald could not get near it, legally or otherwise. So Gerald found another way, I said. Gerald found Pell. Pell had the science. Pell had, I suspect, a grievance of his own against the world of legitimate research and perhaps against specific individuals within it. Gerald provided the critical piece of information that Pell needed, his brother's medical history. The cardiac episode, the records. Holmes poured himself more tea with the slightly mechanical efficiency of someone whose mind is elsewhere. Together, they built a device that would, under the right conditions, kill Cornelius Blackwood without leaving a mark that any physician in 1897 would know how to identify. And Blackwood built his own death chamber, I said. The casing. The bird. Not knowingly, Holmes said. Or, not entirely. I think Cornelius suspected, toward the end, that something was badly wrong. Hence the covered cloth. Hence the nights of sitting alone in the study with the door locked. He was, I think, trying to work out what the mechanism inside the bird was actually doing. He was trying to understand what he had been made a part of. Holmes set down his cup. He was a very intelligent man. He got close enough to frighten himself, but he ran out of time. The image of it settled over me coldly. The old watchmaker, alone in his lamplit study, bending over the beautiful, terrible thing he had built with his own hands, listening to it sing, trying to hear in those 4 pure notes whatever secret they contained, getting closer, getting frightened, and then, one Thursday evening, the frequency finding its mark. He was killed by his own craftsmanship, I said. He was killed by someone who understood that his craftsmanship was the one thing he could never resist, Holmes said. Gerald knew his brother, knew that if the commission was interesting enough, if the mechanical challenge was sufficiently intricate, Cornelius would not ask too many questions until it was too late. He used his brother's greatest quality against him. Holmes's voice was even, but there was something beneath the evenness that I recognized as anger, held carefully in place. That is, in my experience, among the cruelest varieties of murder. We needed one more thing before we could move. We needed Pell. Holmes had an address, the Clerkenwell consulting rooms where Pell apparently worked, but he wanted something else before we went there. He wanted evidence that connected Pell's mechanism to the bird physically and specifically, something that went beyond inference and theory, something that would hold up even if Gerald's lawyers were as expensive as his address suggested they would be. The bird is still in the study, I said. Lestrade's men haven't removed it? Lestrade's men, Holmes said with a slight edge. Ede are not currently inclined to act on my suggestions, but Miss Blackwood has not been informed that the case is officially closed, because it is not officially closed, and she still has authority over her father's premises. He stood. I'm going to ask her for something that will seem like a strange request. I'm going to ask her to have the bird moved. Moved where? To Professor Hargrove's laboratory. He held up a hand before I could speak. I know, but Hargrove's equipment is the only thing in London capable of measuring what that device is producing. And Hargrove, whatever he has omitted to tell us, is not, I am reasonably confident, a man who would refuse to look at evidence of what his former student has done. Something moved in Holmes's face. He has a conscience. I saw it yesterday, underneath everything else. He knows what Pell's research was capable of, and he stopped it, and he believed that stopping it was enough. He's about to discover that it was not. Eleanor Blackwood agreed without hesitation. She was, I thought, a remarkable woman, not ungrieved, but clear-eyed in her grief in a way that made her more rather than less present. She asked Holmes directly whether he knew yet what had happened, and Holmes told her, with a plainness I respected, that he believed he did, and that he needed one more day. She gave it to him. She gave him the bird as well, carefully wrapped in its velvet cloth, placed in a wooden case that had apparently lived beneath the work table. And she did this without asking what he intended to do with it, which struck me as an act of considerable trust toward a man she had known for less than 48 hours. As we were leaving, she said, quietly to Holmes's back, "He was afraid of it at the end, my father." I could hear it in his voice through the door. He kept saying, I could just make out the words. He kept saying, "It shouldn't sound like that. It shouldn't sound like that." And then he stopped saying anything. Holmes turned. His face, for just a moment, was entirely unguarded. "He was right," he said. "It shouldn't have. I'm sorry, Miss Blackwood." She nodded. She did not cry, though I thought she wanted to. We went out into the grey November morning, and Holmes carried the case himself all the way to the cab, and held it on his lap for the entire journey to Albemarle Street. He did not speak, but his hands, I noticed, were very still on the case. Hargrove took one look at the bird and went pale. He said nothing for a long moment. Then he said, "Put it on the frequency table. There, yes, and stand back." He ran his analysis in near silence, moving around his equipment with an efficiency that suggested he already knew, at some level, what he was looking for. When the readings came through, printed on a thin paper roll from a device I could not name, he studied them for a long time before he spoke. 62 cycles, he said. Sustained, with a harmonic overlay at approximately 41. He set the paper down very carefully. Pell's work, this is precisely the frequency range he was theorizing about when I terminated his research. He looked at Holmes. "You knew he was involved." "I suspected," Holmes said. "I needed you to confirm it." Hargrove sat down heavily in his laboratory chair. He looked suddenly, considerably older than he had the day before. "I thought I had stopped it," he said. When I ended his research, I believed, I told myself, that without institutional support he could not continue, that it would simply die. He looked at the bird, sitting on its velvet on the frequency table, still and silent now, its golden feathers catching the laboratory light. It didn't die. No, Holmes said, it learned to sing. The confrontation and the killer revealed. We went to Clerkenwell that afternoon. Not to Gerald's rooms, not yet. Holmes wanted Pell first. He wanted the man who had built the thing, because in his experience, and in mine, the person who constructs a weapon and the person who deploys it are never quite equally committed to silence when the moment of reckoning arrives. The architect of a scheme has, somewhere beneath the calculation, the craftsman's pride, the need, however dangerous, to have the work understood. Holmes had seen it before. He was counting on it now. Pell's consulting rooms were on the 3rd floor of a building on Seckford Street, a quiet, residential sort of street that seemed an unlikely home for anything sinister, which was, Holmes observed as we climbed the stairs, probably the point. The door was plain, unmarked, the kind of door that discourages curiosity by offering nothing to be curious about. Holmes knocked. There was a pause of perhaps 15 seconds, long enough to suggest that the person inside had considered not answering, and then the door opened. Dorian Pell was not what I had expected. I had constructed, from the outline of what we knew, and a picture of someone cold and precise, a man shaped by grievance into something sharp and functional. What I found instead was a person of perhaps 45, who looked considerably older, slight and slightly stooped, with the kind of face that had once been open and had closed gradually over the years, the way a wound closes, leaving something functional but permanently altered. His eyes were intelligent and, I thought, deeply tired. He looked at Holmes. He looked at me. He looked at the wooden case Holmes was carrying. "You'd better come in," he said. The room inside was sparse. A desk, 2 chairs, shelves of technical volumes, a workbench along one wall that was notably cleaner than a workbench in active use tends to be. He had, I noted, already been clearing up. And not panicking, there was nothing frantic about the tidiness, but systematically reducing the evidence of what had been done here. He was a methodical man. He had known at some level that this moment was coming, and he had been preparing for it with the same careful attention he apparently brought to everything. He sat behind his desk. Holmes and I took the 2 chairs. Holmes set the wooden case on the floor beside him, but did not open it. "You know why we're here," Holmes said. It was not a question. "I know Cornelius Blackwood is dead," Pell said. "I read it in the newspaper." His voice was even, too even, in the way that extreme control produces a flatness that is its own kind of expression. "You built the mechanism inside the bird," Holmes said. A pause. Then, "Yes." I had half expected denial, the reflex of self-preservation. The absence of it was, in its way, more unsettling. Holmes, I could see, had not expected it either, though he did not show this in any way that Pell would have noticed. "Tell me about it," Holmes said. And Pell told him. It came out slowly at first, and then with increasing momentum, the way a confession tends to come when a person has been carrying it alone for too long, and the weight has finally exceeded what they are able to bear without assistance. He spoke without drama, without apparent remorse, but without pride either, which was what I had feared most. There was no pleasure in the telling. There was only the exhausted relief of a man setting down something very heavy. He had met Gerald Blackwood 18 months ago at a private dinner hosted by a mutual acquaintance in the manufacturing sector. Gerald had been charming, us interested, and, Pell recognised this now with the benefit of distance, precisely targeted in his interest. He had known who Pell was before they met. He had known about the terminated research. He had known about Hargrove. "He said," Pell told us, "that my work had been suppressed. Not discontinued, suppressed. That Hargrove had ended it, not out of ethical concern, but out of fear that it would outshine his own research. That I had been treated unjustly." He paused. Some of that was true. Enough of it was true that the rest went down more easily than it should have. "He offered you money," Holmes said. "He offered me money," Pell confirmed, "and a laboratory, and—" He stopped. "He offered me the thing that Hargrove had taken away, the chance to finish the work, to prove that it was real, that it functioned, that the theory held." He looked at his hands on the desk. That was the part I cannot excuse. The money I might have walked away from. The work. I could not walk away from the work. You knew what it would be used for, Holmes said, quietly, without judgment in his tone, which was, I thought, more devastating than judgment would have been. I knew it would be used against a specific person, Pell said. Gerald told me it was leverage, that it would frighten Cornelius into a settlement, that no one would be harmed. He looked up then, and for the first time there was something other than flatness in his face. I was not a fool, Mr. Holmes. I knew that what I was building was dangerous. I told myself the danger would be controlled, that Gerald would control it. A pause. I was wrong. Did you calibrate it to Cornelius Blackwood's cardiac frequency specifically? The question sat in the room. Yes, Pell said. Gerald provided the medical records. Yes, I did. Holmes was quiet for a moment. Then he said, and the commission to Blackwood himself, to build the casing? Something crossed Pell's face, something that might, in another conversation, have been called pain. That was Gerald's idea. I argued against it. He said it would be poetic, that Cornelius would build his own cage without knowing it. He exhaled slowly. He also said it would create confusion if anything went wrong, that it would look as though Cornelius had built the device himself, that no investigation would look further. He used his brother's reputation as a shield, Holmes said. Yes. And when did the device activate? It was not, I take it, running continuously. No, it was set to activate at a specific time, triggered by the winding mechanism. Gerald told me he would ensure it was wound at the appropriate moment. Pell's voice had gone very quiet. I did not ask how he would arrange that. I did not want to know. Holmes stood. He picked up the wooden case and set it on the desk in front of Pell. He opened it, folded back the velvet cloth, and the golden bird sat between them in the grey afternoon light, beautiful and terrible and completely still. Pell looked at it for a long time. It was the finest piece of acoustic engineering I have ever produced, he said. That is the most shameful thing I know about myself. Holmes closed the case. Mr. Pell, I'm going to ask you to do something that is not in your immediate interest, but which is, I believe, in your longer interest and in the interest of justice. I'm going to ask you to write down everything you have told me, in your own hand, and to sign it. And then, I'm going to ask you to come with us. Pell looked at him. To Scotland Yard. Eventually. First to Clerkenwell. Gerald Blackwood answered his door himself. He was dressed for an evening engagement. Black coat, white tie, the composed and well-maintained surface of a man who had decided that the best response to the week's events was to behave as though nothing of particular significance had occurred. He looked at Holmes. He looked at Pell, standing slightly behind Holmes's left shoulder. He looked at me. His face did not collapse. I will give him that. Whatever Gerald Blackwood was, he was not a man who collapsed, but something in him, the careful, managed stillness that he had shown us in our first meeting, shifted, not dramatically, just enough. Mr. Holmes, he said, and Dorian. The name came out with a particular flatness that contained, I thought, a very precise calculation. Pell had talked, and Gerald was already, in the space of a heartbeat, revising his position. May we come in, Holmes said, or would you prefer to have this conversation on the landing? Gerald stepped back. We went in. What followed was not, in the dramatic sense, a scene of great confrontation. There were no raised voices. Gerald did not confess in the manner of a man overcome. He was far too controlled for that. But Holmes laid it out for him, piece by piece, with the systematic precision of a man who has thought carefully about the order in which things should be revealed, and Gerald listened. And as he listened, the calculation in his eyes shifted, adjusted, shifted again, like a man playing a game in which the pieces are being removed from the board one by one. When Holmes finished, Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You have a written statement from Pell." "I do." Pell is not a reliable witness. He was a dismissed academic with a grievance and a history of... "The medical records, Mr. Blackwood," Holmes said. "Your brother's cardiac records, which you obtained through your solicitor at the time of the 1896 episode, and which you provided to Mr. Pell with the specific measurements he required. We have the records. We have Pell's documentation of the calibration. We have the device itself, which Professor Hargrove of the Royal Institution has examined, and is prepared to testify to in court." He paused. "We have. In fact, rather more than we need." Gerald looked at Pell. Pell looked at the floor. "You should have controlled it better," Gerald said to him. The tone was not angry. It was the tone of a project manager identifying a process failure. "You told him it would only frighten him," Holmes said. "That was, I suspect, not entirely truthful." Gerald looked at Holmes. Something moved, finally, behind the managed surface of his face. Not guilt, precisely. Not remorse, but something more complicated. The expression of a man confronting the distance between what he had told himself and what had actually been true. "My brother," he said after a moment, "had something that belonged, in part, to me. I had built something with him in the beginning. I had put my money and my years into it. Yeah, and he took it and locked me out of it and offered me terms that were," he stopped, "that were designed to make me go away. And I went, and every year I watched him prosper with what was partly mine, and I..." He stopped again. "So you killed him," Holmes said, plainly, gently even, which was almost worse. Gerald said nothing. "The device in the basement," Holmes said, "the timing mechanism your brother was developing, you wanted it." "It was worth a fortune," Gerald said. The words came out quietly, almost sadly. "You cannot imagine what the manufacturing applications..." "I can imagine precisely," Holmes said. "What I cannot imagine is concluding that a fortune is worth a brother." It was, I think, the only moment in the entire conversation at which Holmes allowed anything personal into his voice. It was brief, a single sentence, and then he was composed again. But Gerald Blackwood heard it, and for just a moment his own composure cracked, not with remorse, but with something raw and less legible, the expression of a man who has spent 4 years telling himself a story about what he was doing and why, and who has just heard in 7 words how the story sounds to someone who has no investment in it. Holmes had already sent a message to Lestrade before we arrived. The inspector and 2 constables appeared at the door of Gerald's rooms within 20 minutes, which was, I thought, a considerable improvement on Lestrade's usual timing, and which suggested that Holmes had composed the message with sufficient specificity to convey that this was not, on this occasion, a false alarm. Gerald went with them without resistance, and he paused at the door once and looked back at the room, at the comfortable furniture, the well-chosen books, the small, careful life he had built in the years of his grievance. And then he looked at Holmes. "How long?" he said. "I beg your pardon?" "How long did it take you to work it out?" Holmes considered this for a moment, with what appeared to be genuine honesty. "Longer than it should have," he said. "I made a significant error in the middle of it that cost me a day." Gerald almost smiled. It was the most human expression I had seen on his face in our entire acquaintance. "I thought you would come sooner," he said. "I'd prepared for sooner." "Then we were," Holmes said, "equally imperfect." Gerald nodded once and went. Epilogue: Greed, Innovation, and the Final Word. Gerald Blackwood stood trial in the spring of 1898. The case attracted considerable attention, not the loud, sensational attention of murders involving passion or violence, but the quieter, more unsettling attention of people who recognized that something new had entered the world and were not entirely sure what to do with that recognition. The newspapers struggled with it. They wanted a villain they could describe in familiar terms, and Gerald was not quite that. He was well dressed. He was articulate. He sat in the dock with the composed patience of a man attending a meeting he had not requested and did not particularly respect, and he answered questions with the careful precision of someone who had decided, quite rationally, that dignity was the only remaining asset worth protecting. Dorian Pell testified for 4 hours. He did so without flinching, which I thought took a kind of courage. Not the admirable kind, not the kind that redeems, but the honest kind that at least has the decency to look at what it has done. He was sentenced separately and more leniently, in acknowledgement of his cooperation and in recognition of the fact that the law, in 1899, had only the bluntest of instruments available for measuring the gradations of culpability in a crime no one had previously imagined. Gerald received 14 years. Professor Hargrove gave a statement to the court and, afterward, a longer and considerably more candid account to Holmes over 2 hours in his Albemarle Street laboratory. He had known, he admitted, that Pell had not simply abandoned his research when dismissed. He had heard whispers, the kind of whispers that move through scientific communities like weather, It's impossible to trace to a source, impossible to entirely ignore. He had chosen not to investigate them. He used the word chose himself without prompting, which Holmes told me afterward he considered the most honest thing said by anyone connected to the case. Hargrove was not charged with anything. The law again had no instrument fine enough for what he had done, which was not a crime but was not nothing either. Holmes said only that the man would carry it, and that carrying it would be, in its way, sufficient. Eleanor Blackwood inherited the shop, the estate, and the contents of the basement workroom, including her father's unfinished timing mechanism. She engaged a patent lawyer within a month of the trial's conclusion. Holmes received a letter from her the following Christmas, brief, warm, and entirely characteristic of the directness I had admired in her from the beginning, informing him that the mechanism had been successfully completed by a colleague of her father's and that the patent application was proceeding. She did not mention Gerald. She did not mention the bird. The bird itself Holmes kept, for a time. It sat on the mantelpiece in Baker Street, silent. He had removed the internal mechanism and sent it to Hargrove for permanent deactivation, its golden feathers catching the light in the mornings when the sun came through the window at the right angle. Mrs. Hudson disliked it intensely, and said so on 3 separate occasions. Holmes ignored her, as he ignored most things that did not bear on whatever problem was currently occupying him. One evening, perhaps 6 months after the trial, I came into the sitting room and found the mantelpiece empty. I asked Holmes what had become of it. "I gave it to Miss Blackwood," he said, without looking up from the monograph he was annotating. "She asked for it. Why would she want it?" "She said," Holmes replied, turning a page, "that she preferred to decide what it meant herself, rather than leave that decision to other people." I thought about that for a moment. "And what do you think it means?" Holmes was quiet for a while, long enough that I thought he was not going to answer, which was not unusual. Then he set down his pen and looked at the empty mantelpiece, and at the rectangle of slightly less faded wallpaper where the bird had sat, and he said, "I think it means that the things we build do not stay where we put them. I think it means that a man can spend his life making beautiful, precise, careful things, and that the precision and the care are no protection at all against what someone else decides to do with them." He picked up his pen again. "I think it means that knowledge without conscience is not a neutral quantity. It does not simply sit there, it finds a use." He went back to his monograph. The fire crackled. Outside, London continued, as London always continued, indifferent and enormous and full of people building things and other people watching them do it and thinking about what those things might be worth. I picked up my notebook. I wrote down what he had said as accurately as I could remember it. I thought it was worth keeping.